When Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, it came as a big surprise to both Stalin and the Allied powers. After all, they had been in good terms until recently, and even signed a treaty of non-aggression in 1939. Nonetheless, Germany ordered their troops to invade the neighboring nation and to charge against Moscow in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. During the campaign, the Germans were profoundly surprised to learn that the Red Army had recruited so many women to fight alongside men. Indeed, this was an anomaly in any army of the time, and even today. For some German soldiers and officers, to know that they were fighting against women was a disgusting thought, but for others it enticed their most basic fantasies. It is calculated that more than 800,000 Soviet women served in the Red Army during World War II. Female soldiers who were directly involved in combat achieved particular international renown. The night bomber pilots known as night witches and the female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko and Rosa Shanina are the most extraordinary examples of female participation in the war. Between 1941 and 1945, a total of 2,484 Soviet female snipers were deployed for the war, and their combined tally of kills is estimated to be at least 11,280. At first, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, thousands of women presented themselves in Red Army offices to volunteer, but most of them were turned away as they had no experience in the battlefield. However, after massive losses in the face of Operation Barbarossa, attitudes had to be changed, ensuring a greater role for women who wanted to fight. The High Command of the Red Army allowed for women to be drafted, and they were incorporated in great numbers to medical and auxiliary units, but also to fighting battalions. However, more than half of these women worked in the medical service of the Soviet armed forces. They accounted for 41% of the frontline doctors and 100% of the nursing staff. Those near the front performed their duties under especially difficult conditions and in constant mortal danger. Military medical personnel were second only to the infantry in terms of the number of combat losses. For this reason, thousands of women were awarded the status of hero of the Soviet Union, being praised and loved in their communities once the war was over. But for others, it was a completely different story. Around 6 million Soviet women died in the course of the war, around 2.5 million of which were involved in the Partisan war against the occupying Nazis. There is no definitive number of Soviet women that became prisoners of war or were captured by the Nazis, but estimates are in the tens of thousands. Most of them did not live to tell what horrible fate awaited them in the Nazis' hands, as the Germans knew the best way for them to remain silent was to execute them. Some others, however, survived the war and were able to tell their stories. The Nazis' extraordinary cruelty against women. The story of Tatiana Nikolaevna Baramzina might perhaps be the best example both of the bravery of Soviet women during World War II and the incredible cruelty exerted by Nazi soldiers, specifically on enemy women. Baramzina had been born in a small Siberian town in 1919. Hearing stories of the glorious Red Army, one of her dreams was to become a military pilot. Instead, she studied to become a teacher. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union and Baramzina learned that other women were volunteering, she immediately entered a 6-month nursing course, just so she had something to offer in the Army recruitment office. Initially refused entrance into the Army, she went on to graduate with honors from a sharpshooting course, leading to her being accepted into the Central Women's Sniper Training School in June 1943. After graduating from the school in March 1944, she was deployed to the Western Front as a sniper in the 252nd Rifle Regiment. Having arrived on the war front on the 3rd of April 1944, within a week, she had already made her first kill. Showing amazing skills, she quickly improved her tally to 16 kills with a sniper rifle. Her comrades were impressed by her marksmanship, and she was assigned to increasingly more dangerous operations. Later in 1944, she was transferred to Byelorussia as part of Operation Bagration. At this point, she had begun to experience sight issues, so her superiors chose to give her telephone operation duties far from the front line. For this reason, she was not intended to take part in a special operation scheduled for the 4th of July. However, in the end, she managed to convince her commander to let her go, citing her sniper and medical training. Baramzina's unit hid in a village named Pekalin, where they intended to ambush the German column, who was not expecting any resistance. The Germans were retreating from a battle elsewhere, and the Soviets counted on them being disorganized. Soon, Red Army artillery ambushed the column from both sides as it approached the outskirts of the village. With nowhere to retreat to, the Nazi troops fought non-stop and eventually managed to hold the village for several hours. Some of the Soviet soldiers who were too badly wounded in the battle to retreat into a grain field for concealment were placed in a dugout recently taken from the enemy. There, Baramzina chose to stay with them, placing herself in mortal danger of being attacked, despite having every opportunity to leave the dugout and crawl into a field where she would be safe, as the German soldiers were too busy trying to flee the Soviet encirclement to pursue the survivors hiding in the forest and grain field. While tending to the wounded, German soldiers approached the dugout, and she defended it for as long as she could, despite being heavily outnumbered. When the first 3 German soldiers ran up to the dugout, she opened fire with a machine gun, killing them. When more attackers approached, she opened additional fire, determined to fight until her last breath or until she ran out of ammunition. This was exactly what happened, and the brave soldier finally found herself with no more weapons to use. After running out of grenades to throw at her attackers, she was left defenseless as 2 German soldiers entered the dugout from behind and threw their grenades down, injuring her before entering. The Germans were so enraged and possibly fearful that they first opened fire against the injured soldiers laying around the dugout, killing them without mercy. They left Baramzina for last, dragging her out by her hair before brutally torturing her. With endless cruelty, the soldiers stabbed Baramzina and mutilated her with bayonets, while she loudly swore that they would pay for their crimes. She was brutally beaten with the butts of German rifles until she was barely alive. It was at this moment that one of the Germans had the idea of shooting her in the head with an anti-tank rifle, intended to pierce several inches of steel. She was killed at point blank, and her head and body were practically unrecognizable when the rest of her battalion found her the next morning. They could not believe the malice that went into torturing and murdering their brave comrade. Soviet women at camps for prisoners of war. Baramzina's calvary, however, was actually short in comparison to what other Soviet women had to endure during World War II. Particularly in the concentration camps and prisoner of war camps along Germany and Poland, the punishments and tortures were a daily occurrence. Soviet prisoners of war were treated differently in concentration camps. For example, they were the first ones to be tattooed with numbers in Auschwitz. This was because Soviet soldiers frequently attempted to escape from the camp. The largest mass escape attempt occurred in Auschwitz-Birkenau on November 6, 1942, when several dozen of them made a run for it as it became dark. Many of them were caught immediately and led back to the camp. Only a few succeeded. The others were tracked down, returned to Auschwitz, and shot. The Soviets had a reputation of disrupting the order in the camps, so Heinrich Himmler himself ordered in 1941 the immediate execution of captured Soviet commissars and suspicious civilian political functionaries. More than 80% of frontline German divisions fighting on the Eastern Front carried out this illegal order, shooting an estimated 4,000 to 10,000 commissars. Some divisions, knowing full well that following this order amounted to committing war crimes, chose to send the captured soldiers and officers to concentration camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka, which were close to the Eastern Front. The Nazis also saw women as disruptive. This is why Himmler also ordered that female combatants in the Soviet army were shot on sight rather than captured and brought to the camps. And again, while some units did not execute these female soldiers, few survived to reach prisoner of war camps in Germany or Poland. There was another reason for the cruelty with which Soviet prisoners of war, and especially women, were treated. The Nazi regime claimed that it was under no obligation for the humane care of prisoners of war from the Red Army, because the Soviet Union had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, nor had it specifically declared its commitment to the 1907 Hague Convention on the Rules of War. Technically, both nations, therefore, were bound only by the general international law of war as it had developed in modern times, yet even under that law, prisoners of war were to be protected. Red Army women were often pressured to renounce their prisoner of war status to be transferred to civilian forced labor programs. Some refused and were sent to gas chambers inside the concentration camps. About 1,000 Soviet women were imprisoned at Ravensbrück and others at Auschwitz, Majdanek and Mauthausen. Few of them were reported to survive. Every morning the guards would do a roll call and have every female prisoner form a line in front of the barracks. Then they would select which of the prisoners went to the gas chambers and who would go to the work commandos, chopping wood in the neighboring forests or fetching water from a nearby river. Females deported from the occupied parts of the Soviet Union for forced labor in the Reich were often beaten or sexually assaulted or forced to submit to sexual relations for food or other necessities or basic comforts. Pregnancy sometimes resulted for Polish, Soviet, or Yugoslav forced laborers from sexual relations with German men. Women were generally forced to have abortions, sent to give birth in makeshift nurseries where conditions would guarantee the death of the infants, or simply shipped to the region they came from without food or medical care. The Germans established brothels in some concentration and labor camps, and the German army ran roughly 500 brothels for soldiers, in which Soviet women were forced to do sexual work for Nazis. According to the German racial laws of 1938, it was illegal for German Aryans to have sexual relations with the Jewish, Romani Gypsies, Asians and blacks, but rules were less strict when it came to sex with Russian women. For this reason, German concentration camp guards felt like they could do whatever they wanted to the female Soviet prisoners. Many women incarcerated in the concentration camps created informal mutual assistance groups which facilitated survival through sharing information, food and clothing. Soviet women were trained to do so on account of being raised in the communist principles. Often, the members of such groups came from the same city or province, had had a similar level and style of education, or shared family ties. There are many reports of Polish and Jewish women who claimed they were able to survive thanks to the help of the Soviet women in the camps. Other women were able to survive when the SS camp authorities deployed them in clothing repair, cooking, laundry, and house-cleaning detachments. Others still managed to survive thanks to other sickening habits of the German camp staff. An Auschwitz block called Kanada, sexual slavery and brutality. Most of the women at Auschwitz had their heads shaved, were malnourished, mortally sick, or on the verge of death. The others, who still were considered attractive by the camp guards, were sent to work in a block known as Kanada. The Soviet women were considered particularly beautiful by the German soldiers, so many of them ended up in this disgusting building inside Auschwitz. The name of the block came from the hope and expectations of the prisoners, as Kanada had become a fantasy destination for many Europeans at that time. It was widely thought that it was a country rich in everything. In the Kanada inside Auschwitz, women had access to food, could enjoy some basic goods such as cigarettes and water, and they were allowed to take showers frequently. They also were allowed to grow their hair. In exchange, they had to do whatever the guards asked them to. The women who worked in Kanada were constantly followed by SS men, not only to supervise their work, but often to rob them, and many times to sexually assault them. The Kommandant in charge of the SS at Kanada had ordered a running water system to be built in the building to allow these women to bathe, so that they would be more presentable to the ravenous maw of the officers who chose to pervert the Nazis' racial laws. Shower time was a very tempting moment for those devils in uniform. Whenever they saw these helpless women trying to clean their bodies, they stepped in to assault them. Many of these women, although they did not experience the daily physical punishment and hardships and starvation suffered by others, lived through a daily hell of constant aggression. To make matters worse, many of them, after having suffered the voracious sexual appetites of their captors, were forced to write postcards explaining how well they were treated inside Auschwitz, in order to dispel rumors that this was in fact a torture and extermination camp. Some of these women were selected directly from their barracks. It was not uncommon for SS officers to arrive drunk at night and hand-pick a few of the younger Soviet girls to be transferred to Kanada. There are many reports of the same girls crying inconsolably upon returning to their barracks. Others, however, did not return and were kept at Kanada indefinitely, at least as long as the officers were happy with them. SS men felt that they were the absolute masters of the fate of these women. They controlled the sexual, physical, and emotional aspects of their lives, making them feel absolute and constant humiliation. Since the German racial laws were passed in 1935, It was illegal as well as immoral for a pure German to be married or even have intercourse with someone from an inferior race. But this did not prevent SS men from attacking night after night the girls in Canada. The certainty of impunity and large quantities of alcohol gave these officers a feeling of omnipotence. They thought they were above the law and thus were allowed to do whatever they wanted with these poor Jewish women. The rate of survival inside Canada may have been higher than in any other block at Auschwitz, but the price to pay was too high. Several female ex-prisoners have since testified that they would have preferred to die before having to go through the hell that was lived inside Canada. However, it is possible that we will never really know the truth of what happened behind those walls. This is due to the silence and complicity of the SS men who took advantage of the prisoners during the war, but also because many victims who survived this hell preferred to keep secret rather than tell the lurid details of the sexual assaults of which they were victims. The pattern of behavior of the SS men toward the women of Auschwitz fits the behavior of many soldiers toward enemy women, seeing them as an indefensible instrument for perpetrating unspeakable revenge. Furthermore, although their actions were punishable by law, most of the times they got away with it. Gerhard Palitsch, one of the report officers at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, was one of the SS men known to have had sexual relationships with Jewish prisoners in camp. He was reported and arrested, but almost certainly, thanks to the influence of Höss, was punished merely by being transferred to a subcamp away from Auschwitz. Many SS men avoided this kind of punishment thanks to choosing Soviet women over Jewish ones. Women Soviet partisans, sabotaging Nazi plans. As soon as the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, the people in most cities and towns organized themselves to fight the invaders. Women contributed in large numbers to the Soviet partisan movement, mainly because they saw it as an opportunity to finally fight for their country, after the recruitment offices of the Red Army usually turned them down. In fact, many women were among the most famous and heroic partisans, especially very young ones. In October 1941, an 18-year-old high school student from Moscow named Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya volunteered for a partisan unit. Together with other partisans, Kosmodemyanskaya marched southwest toward Narofominsk, crossing the front line into territory occupied by the Germans. They mined roads and cut communication lines. On November 27, 1941, Kosmodemyanskaya received an assignment to burn the village of Petrishchevo, where a German cavalry regiment was stationed. Together with fellow partisans Boris Krenov and Vasily Klubkov, she set fire to 3 houses in the village, but this was not enough, and she was caught alone trying to burn a 4th house. After being arrested, Kosmodemyanskaya was stripped, beaten, interrogated, and savagely tortured with 200 lashes. Her body was also burnt in several places, but she refused to give any information. The following morning, she was marched to the center of the village with a board around her neck bearing the inscription "House Burner." At the central square, she was hanged and left for everyone to see. Kosmodemyanskaya was the first woman to become hero of the Soviet Union during the war in February 16, 1942. Young as she might have been, Kosmodemyanskaya was not the youngest woman to become a hero of the Soviet Union. This honor belongs to another brave resistance fighter, Zinaida Portnova. In 1942, at the age of 16, Portnova joined the Belarusian resistance movement, becoming a member of the local underground organization named Young Avengers. She began by distributing Soviet propaganda leaflets in German-occupied Belarus, collecting and hiding weapons for Soviet soldiers, and reporting on German troop movements. After learning how to use weapons and explosives from the older members of the group, Portnova participated in sabotage actions at a gas pump, a local power plant, and a brick factory. It was later estimated that these acts may have killed upwards of 100 German soldiers. In 1943, Portnova became employed as a kitchen aide in Obol. In August, she poisoned the food meant for the Nazi garrison stationed there. She was interrogated by a Gestapo officer in the village of Goriani. The officer, convinced that she was only a harmless girl, left his guard down. Portnova took the investigator's pistol off the table, then shot and killed him. When 2 German soldiers entered after hearing the gunshots, she shot them as well. She then attempted to escape the compound and ran into the woods, where she was caught near the banks of a river. After being recaptured, Portnova was tortured. She was later driven into the forest and executed. She was not 18 at the time. In 1958, Portnova was posthumously made a hero of the Soviet Union. There is a monument to her in the city of Minsk, and some youth pioneer movement detachments were named after her. Female spies and espionage in Europe. When one thinks of female spies, there is one name that inevitably comes to mind: Mata Hari. Mata Hari embodied all the intrigue of espionage in the 20th century and remains the most famous female spy in history. She was a Dutch dancer turned spy during World War I, who is said to have seduced diplomats and military officers into giving up their secrets. She was active for close to a year, mostly in France. On the 13th of February 1917, Mata Hari was arrested in her room at the Hotel Élysée Palace on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. She was tried on the 24th of July, accused of spying for Germany and of revealing details of the Allies' new weapon. A week later, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Mata Hari was executed by a firing squad consisting of 12 French soldiers just before dawn on the 15th of October 1917. She was 41 years old at the time. According to eyewitnesses, she refused to wear a blindfold and to be bound, and solemnly walked along to the place where she was to be shot. Her last action was to defiantly blow a kiss to the firing squad. After her death, her legacy lived on, not only in the cultural memory of the West, but in the army headquarters of the world's most advanced nations. For this reason, when World War II broke in 1939, most countries were keen on employing women as well as men for intelligence missions. The United Kingdom created the Women's Auxiliary Air Force on 28 June 1939 for women to work at military installations in the home front. The Special Operations Executive, or SOE, began recruiting female spies as soon as it was created in 1940. This organization directly employed or controlled more than 13,000 people all over Europe, of whom 3,200 were women. The Soviet Union had been already recruiting women into the ranks of their spies since the decade before. One of the most effective Soviet spies was Ursula Kuczynski, a German Jew, a passionate communist codenamed Sonia. The Soviet agent, Richard Sorg, recruited Kuczynski in Shanghai in the early 1930s. Sonia survived the war, and in the 1940s she was the handler of the Manhattan Project physicist Klaus Fuchs, who slipped her documents providing the nuclear know-how that proved essential to the Soviet Union's development of an atomic bomb. She was never caught. War specialists in the 1940s generally agreed that female spies would have distinct advantages over the men on the ground. Women could travel freely because they were not expected to work during the day. Gender stereotypes also helped keep the women above suspicion. After all, who could possibly imagine a woman could be a viable combatant in war? Women were more than viable, however. They were critical to the success of espionage missions. Though they would later be honored for their conspicuous courage, the female spies of the Soviet Union and other Allied powers were successful because they learned to be inconspicuous. They took on secret identities, went on secret missions, and were trusted with their nation's greatest secrets. It was expected that women operatives used their femininity and played up to stereotypes of fragility or helplessness in order to get out of sticky situations, or to gain access to different places. In fact, Winston Churchill and his men soon found out that, as several wartime accounts indicate, male agents were generally less resourceful and inventive than their female colleagues. Each agent, male or female, was given a code name or an alias and trained in specialist skills including wireless operation, how to maintain a cover story, and how to burgle and pick locks. Olga Benario Prestes, double agent caught in Brazil. Several Soviet spies suffered horrifying fates in the hands of the Nazis. Olga Benario Prestes was killed in a Nazi euthanasia center soon after she turned 34. The daughter of Jewish parents, Olga was 15 when she first joined the Communist Youth Organization in Munich, Germany. Over the years, Olga grew into a brave communist activist. She became involved in politics, primarily influenced by communist leader Professor Otto Braun, with whom she also shared a relationship. Before the war, Braun was imprisoned near Berlin, and his young lover helped him escape. Then she realized she could not stay in Berlin any longer. She was simply no longer safe in Germany. Her daring feat of aiding in a prison break had brought her into the limelight. As the search in Germany intensified and the net closed around her, she was forced to escape. She first went to Czechoslovakia, where she reunited with Braun, and the two went to Moscow. There she attended the Lenin School of the Communist International and worked as an instructor of their youth wing. She conducted anti-fascist activities, first in the Soviet Union, then later in France and Great Britain, where she was arrested but released soon after. In 1931, Olga parted with Otto Braun and went to attend the Zhukovsky Military Academy, after which she was thought to be an agent of the Soviet military intelligence. In 1934, she was assigned as a bodyguard to Luis Carlos Prestes and was to aid his return to Brazil. In order to complete the mission, documents were forged stating they were a married Portuguese couple. By the time the two of them reached Rio de Janeiro in 1935, they had become a married couple in reality. In 1935, Prestes staged his coup against President Vargas. The attempt failed miserably, and Olga and Prestes had to go into hiding. After months of searching for the fugitives, they were found. Vargas had ordered that Prestes be shot on sight, but just when the police were about to fire on him, Olga, who was 2 or 3 months pregnant with their child, stepped in front of him. Not only was he her husband, but she was also his bodyguard, and her duty was to protect him. The Brazilian police did not know what to do, and Prestes's shooting was prevented. Olga was captured by the Brazilians and sentenced to prison in Rio de Janeiro. Since Getulio Vargas was on good terms with Adolf Hitler, a diplomatic ally, he sent Olga back to Germany as a present to Hitler. After the Brazilian government handed Olga over to the Gestapo, she was sent to the female prison Barnimstrasse in Berlin. Already pregnant, she spent a few months in prison and gave birth to her daughter there. Soon after she gave birth, Olga was sent to the Lichtenberg concentration camp in 1938. In the spring of 1939, she was moved to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück had recently been declared the new women's camp, and Olga rode on one of the first transports from Lichtenberg. The old looming fortress was now the main concentration camp for German female prisoners. Perhaps it was because the Germans thought her dangerous and brave enough to attempt anything that they never kept her in the same place for a long time. She was also held in solitary confinement so she wouldn't have a chance to make friends or form connections. She was a heroine among others detained at the camps. The women admired her courage and were sympathetic to her heartbreak at losing her husband and having her child taken away. In 1940, Olga and 79 other prisoners were sent to a bunker where she stayed for 30 days and was monitored day and night by heavy security. There, she was interrogated and tortured and was almost dead before she was allowed to leave the barracks and return to the camp. The next day, beaten and bruised, she went to work a 12-hour shift at the Siemens factory. In February 1942, there was an announcement in the central courtyard of Ravensbrück. The names of the women to be transferred to other concentration camps were being called out. 150 names later, the voice said, Olga Benario Prestes. The transfer to another concentration camp was a cover for sending women to the euthanasia center in Bernburg, where they were murdered. Olga wrote one last letter to her husband and daughter, and 10 days later she, along with the other transferees, climbed into a truck and left for Bernburg. There, she was gassed to death. Who were the brave night witches of the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union was a pioneering nation in terms of gender equality. Perhaps the best example of this was the creation of an all-female night bomber regiment, known as the 588th Regiment between 1942 and 1943, and the 46th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, from there to the end of World War II. The Germans had a nickname for this terrifying group of women pilots, the Night Witches. The regiment came to be when Major Marina Raskova used her position and personal contacts with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to obtain permission to form female combat units. Combat facilitated and ushered in a reluctant acceptance of women in military, based more upon practicality and necessity than for equality. On October 8, 1941, an order was issued to deploy 3 women's Air Force units, including the 588th Regiment. The regiment, formed by Raskova and led by Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, was composed primarily of female volunteers in their late teens and early 20s. The women at the 588th Regiment quickly became known for their daring exploits. An attack technique of the night bombers involved idling the engine near the target and gliding to the bomb release point with only wind noise left to reveal their presence. German soldiers thought the approaching idling planes sounded like broomsticks and hence named the pilots Night Witches. Due to the weight of the bombs and the low altitude of flight, The pilots did not carry parachutes until 1944, so the earlier missions were incredibly risky. Collectively, the Night Witches flew over 23,000 sorties and dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on enemy forces. Being a Soviet war pilot was one of the most dangerous roles a woman could have. Apart from the risk of being shot down, especially when parachutes were not a common occurrence, the Germans had a reputation for shooting all the pilots they captured. Moreover, if a pilot was captured and later released, she would be considered a traitor in the Soviet Union just for letting themselves get caught. In August 1942, the Night Witches Regiment was forced to hastily retreat from its airfield due to German tanks advancing. When the remainder of the regiment took off, an engineer named Sofia Ozerkova, with fellow mechanic Glafira Kashirina and 2 pilots, stayed behind until the last minute, waiting for repairs to be finished on 2 planes. Unable to complete the repairs on one of the planes due to a lack of spare parts, Ozerkova made the decision to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands and set the grounded biplane on fire. The 2 engineers proceeded to walk for weeks to reach their regiment, at one point encountering German soldiers on motorcycles, one of whom attempted to search Kashirina's food pail, which was concealing a pistol wrapped in a scarf at the bottom. However, Ozerkova's quick reflexes saved them when she immediately grabbed her pistol and shot the 2 German soldiers at close range before fleeing into nearby bushes. During the approximately 3-week ordeal, Kashirina became very weak from typhus. Eventually, they reunited with a contingent of Red Army soldiers in the area, and locating the Kommandant, Ozerkova reported on her situation, then took Kashirina to the hospital before hitching a ride to her regiment in a car. Upon her return to the regiment, she was warmly greeted by her comrades, especially the technicians she had previously trained, but the joy was short-lived. The military police suddenly forbade her from returning to her duties and insisted on summoning her for questioning, demanding to know how she avoided being surrounded and where her Communist Party membership card was. For obvious reasons, she had not wanted to be identified as a party member if she was searched or captured by the Germans, so she had destroyed the card. Despite the honesty of her answers, she was still subjected to a military tribunal and sentenced to death. Subsequently imprisoned, her shoulder straps indicating her officer rank were taken and her head was shaved. She refused suggestions that she write a request for a pardon, but was saved by clemency from the higher command after a review of her case had the charges dropped. Ozerkova and Kashirina's story is just one example of how brave and loyal to their country the Night Witches were. Anna Yegorova, daring pilot and Soviet patriot. What happened to pilots who were captured by the Nazis? The story of Anna Yegorova is perhaps the best example of the dark fate that awaited the fallen pilots in the Soviet Union and in Germany. Yegorova was just a teenager helping to dig Moscow's first subway line when she learned that the government was recruiting young people to learn how to fly airplanes for the military. In response, the air club nearby had purchased 4 U-2 planes and 3 gliders. Anna had always wanted to fly, so she applied immediately, but when she told her subway brigade foreman, he was less than enthusiastic. "Let the men do the flying," he said to her. But Yegorova ignored his advice, and by the summer of 1941 she not only had her pilot's license, but also had become a flying instructor, working at the flying club in Kalinin, 100 miles northwest of Moscow. Most of her students were young men. On June 22, 1941, Anna was relaxing with 3 girlfriends in some woods near Kalinin when she learned that the Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union. When she learned that the Kalinin Flying Club would be moving to the rear of the fighting, she took a train to Moscow. There she asked the colonel in charge if she might go to the front. He did not want to send her to the front and suggested that she would be much more useful back in Kalinin training more pilots. But Anna wouldn't take no for an answer. He finally relented, but when Anna arrived at the Moscow Aero Club, it had been evacuated. While wondering what to do next, Anna met a lieutenant from the 130th Air Liaison Squadron, an all-male unit that was headed to the front lines of fighting in the southern section of the war. Anna asked to join, and while at first he was unsure that they would accept a woman among all the male pilots, he had her papers and flying skills checked. She passed all the exams and was accepted into the 130th Flying Regiment. 2 days later, she received her U-2, a biplane made of wood and cloth. The U-2s were slow and highly flammable, but they could land in small areas and were easy to maneuver out of danger. Moreover, Anna had extensive experience with the U-2s because her flying club at Kalinin had a couple of them. Anna's main job was reconnaissance and communications. The Red Army was suffering from lack of coordinated efforts, and so she was often part of the effort to improve communication between different fighting units. One day, Anna was ordered to fly to the 1st Cavalry Corps because they needed a radio. But when she landed in the designated village, she didn't see them anywhere. Leaving the plane running, she ran to a nearby hut, tapping on the window to ask for information. An old man opened the door. When she asked about the Soviet troops, the man warned her that the Germans had arrived the previous night. She turned around to see that there were Germans standing near the next hut, their backs to her. She feared for her life but thought fast, ran to her plane and took off. Below her, she heard the crackle of machine gun fire. She looked down. The old man was lying face down in the snow, and the Germans were now taking aim at her. Bullets shattered the plane's dashboard mirror, but Anna escaped, and that evening she located the cavalryman and delivered the radio. In April 1942, she was nominated for adult membership in the Communist Party and was also awarded with the Order of the Red Banner for her work, but there was much more work to be done. On May 20th, Anna was ordered to deliver a top-secret package to the headquarters of the 9th Air Army. As she flew in her U-2, she could see the frantic movements of the Soviet troops below her as they retreated from the advancing Germans. Stalin had refused to listen to his military advisors and had ordered an attack on this German-occupied territory to liberate it. The Soviets were badly outnumbered, and fires were breaking out everywhere from the battle. From Anna's airborne perspective, it seemed that all of the Soviet Union was on fire. Her attention was suddenly moved to the skies above her, where 2 Soviet planes were battling 6 German Messerschmitt fighter planes. As Anna watched, she saw one of the German planes break away and come after her. Anna tried to fly out of his range, but the German pilot took aim and his machine gun bullets hit Anna's plane, setting it on fire. Anna landed the burning plane and jumped out, trying to put out the fire on her uniform as she ran for some nearby woods, the Messerschmitt pilot in hot pursuit shooting her with his machine gun. Sometimes she would fall down, pretending to be hit, then get up again. The Messerschmitt pilot eventually gave up, probably because he ran out of ammunition, and she caught a ride to the 9th Army headquarters, where she delivered the package and received medical attention for her burns. She was upset about losing her plane, but one of the men tried to encourage her. After all, she was alive and the package had been delivered. That fall, the Germans continued to push the Red Army back in many places. Anna's squadron was doing reconnaissance missions in the Alagir region while being pursued by some Messerschmitts. Anna, trying to avoid being hit, accidentally crashed the right wing of her plane into a tree. She survived, but her plane didn't. Anna knew that she was in trouble. There was no evidence amid the wreckage that the Germans had hit the plane. This was her fault, and the Red Army was notorious for their punishment against inept and cowardly soldiers. Sometimes they would not be disciplined, but instead sent to the so-called penalty battalions. There, punished soldiers and Gulag prisoners would be sent on suicide missions, but Anna's commander knew of her bravery, and he transferred her to a different regiment instead. In the new regiment, Anna asked to be trained to fly a Sturmovik plane. The Ilyushin 2-2, nicknamed Sturmovik, was an armored ground attack plane with a single engine. It was slow and heavy, but it carried heavy firepower. The Sturmovik was also known as a flying tank and was equipped with machine guns, cannons, bombs, and even could fire rockets. Anna quickly became used to the Sturmovik. In early 1943, the commanding officer of the 230th Attack Aviation Division came to inspect the training camp looking for recruits. Anna told him she wanted to join. Impressed with her history, he took her on. On midday, August 20th, 1944, the 230th was ready to help the Red Army, which was pushing the Germans westward. Anna, now squadron commander, was waiting for the green hour, signaling their takeoff. She saw it, pulled on her parachute, jumped into the cockpit of her plane, cranked her engine and tested the radio. Everything was working. She took off. 15 Sturmoviks followed her in formation. The Vistula River soon came into view. To the right lay Warsaw, which was covered in smoke. Her navigator spotted German fighter planes and sent out a warning flare. Long-range anti-aircraft guns read at the Soviet planes, shells exploding close to her plane. Anna was in particular danger because the enemy always targeted the lead plane. She needed to get out of the range of anti-aircraft guns before unloading her bombs on the German tanks below. Then, as she dropped the bombs, her plane jerked upward as if someone had pushed it. Anna felt 2 more such pushes. The plane was becoming difficult to maneuver. Someone on the radio, seeing her in trouble, told her to make a U-turn and crash land on the side controlled by the Soviet Union. But the plane stick would not work and the canopy was stuck. Soon, flames and smoke filled the cockpit. The plane exploded. Anna was blown out of it and lost consciousness. When she came to, she was falling through the air. She pulled her parachute ring, but it had burned and opened only partially. She hit the ground hard. When she opened her eyes, Anna was in terrible pain. She couldn't move. But worse than all of that was who she saw standing over her, his boot on her chest, a soldier in the grey-green uniform of the Nazi army. She was put on a stretcher by 2 Polish medics and sent to a medical facility. The Nazis had no time to waste on her, while the Soviet airplanes were still flying overhead. A Soviet medic named Yulia Krashchenko stayed by her side, nursing her burns as best she could, even when they were both put on a cargo train for a 5-day trip, which to Anna felt like hell. When she was unloaded from the train, German soldiers swarmed around her stretcher, trying to get a glimpse of the captured female pilot. Anna had just arrived at the Kustrin prisoner of war camp, called Stalag 3C, filled with male Allied prisoners of war. Anna and Yulia were placed in a concrete cell with iron bars. The Germans didn't torture Anna. They were just going to let her die slowly and painfully of her wounds. The crash had injured her spine, head, arms, leg and ribs, and had burned the skin on her legs and feet. But there was a skilled surgeon in the camp, a Soviet prisoner named Georgy Fyodorovich Sinyakov. He demanded to treat Anna. Because Dr. Sinyakov had once healed the son of a Gestapo officer, he was granted his wish. The prisoners in the camp were rallying for Anna, and many gave the doctor their Red Cross packets for her and made her little gifts. Dr. Sinyakov saved Anna's life. Then, without warning, he was replaced by a German medic who changed Anna's dressings in cold silence. Yulia was shot for arguing with an SS officer who tried to tempt Anna into turning against the Soviets. Anna was all alone. On January 31st, 1945, when the Red Army defeated the Germans at the Battle of Kustrin, the POW camp was liberated. All former camp prisoners were ordered to the town of Landsberg. Although she had by this time owned over 270 missions and should have been considered a hero, Anna was placed in a prison with German prisoners of war, because all Soviet prisoners of war were considered traitors for having been caught. The commandant of this branch kept Anna up all night, accusing her of being a German spy. Whatever she said, he would not believe her and call her a German dog. On the 11th day of this interrogation, Anna gathered what little strength she had, ran up the stairs to the commandant's quarters and cried, "When are you going to stop tormenting me? Kill me if you like, but I won't let you torment me any more." Anna fell unconscious. When she came to, she was told that the doctors from the Kustrin camp had approached the commandant on her behalf, vouching for her. Anna was free from false accusations. They offered her to stay at the camp and work with them, but all she wanted to do was to find her regiment, which was supposed to be fighting somewhere nearby. They let her go and she found the regiment, but she was disappointed to be declared by the Soviet military doctors to be physically unable to fly. When the war finally ended, Anna returned home to learn that her mother had held a memorial service for her. She had been told her daughter had been killed in action. In 1965, Anna was honored for her wartime work with the Hero of the Soviet Union Gold Medal. The honor had been granted to her posthumously in 1944, but when it was discovered that she had survived the crash and had been taken prisoner, it had been revoked. Not only this, but her Communist Party license had also been revoked again, because prisoners of war were considered traitors to the regime. Real heroes were supposed to be killed in action or tortured to death, but not survive the death camps and come back to the Soviet Union. There are perhaps thousands of stories of Soviet women who were made prisoners by the Nazis, and the Soviet Union turned their back on them, preventing us from knowing what really happened to them when they were captured. Soviet women showed throughout World War II an astounding bravery, which made them fierce enemies to the Nazis. They were feared and hated in equal measure, and for this reason they received a harsh punishment when they came into the hands of the Germans. Despite this, Soviet women were appreciated for their beauty, so they were constantly subject to sexual assault, especially in the Nazi concentration camps. Others were simply shot on sight, killed in awful ways, or tortured to death. Most Soviet women who managed to escape from the Nazis demanded to go back to the front line to fight immediately, even when they were undergoing tremendous pain from their wounds. Their stories should serve as a reminder of the stakes that these women assumed when going undercover into enemy territory. Some of them came back on the field, even when they had managed to escape once. These women gave their lives for the greater good of a peaceful Europe and a world free of fascism. May their heroic and incredible stories be a reminder that our world today is what it is thanks to them, and to the hundreds of anonymous heroines whose names and stories did not survive the test of time.